Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today we've got another interesting document to look at. This video goes hand in hand with a video we shot a couple of months ago about the scope of work for reactivating the ship for Vietnam. There's a link for that down below in the description. Today's video is about the scope of work when decommissioning the ship in 1957. So this is what they did to decommission the ship, and then the 67 report is what they were doing to reactivate the ship a decade later after she'd been in the mothball fleet. So this is a very interesting document. It seems to be from New Jersey's commanding officer to Wisconsin's commanding officer. New Jersey is the first one of the Iowas decommissioned in the 50s, sort of. Missouri remains in continuous commission from when she's put into service at the end of World War II all the way up until 1955. And then she's decommissioned in 55. The other Iowas continued to be modernized and continued to serve for a few years after that, and then they go into the decommissioning process. Also notable, Missouri is decommissioned in Bremerton, Washington. The other three Iowas are all decommissioned here on the East Coast. So, and one of the things that this document brings up is that New Jersey is the first one of the battleships being decommissioned there on the East Coast. So it is new for both the crew of the ship and for the shipyards that they're working with to get this work done. So none of these shipyards will have decommissioned any ships since the late 40s, or any battleships since the late 40s, when all of them were taken out of service except Missouri. And Missouri's deactivation work all takes place on the West Coast, so that's a completely different group of guys. So this is a learning experience. The other interesting thing here is New Jersey has a longer period to do the work than Iowa or Wisconsin. And this is extremely interesting because the narrative has always been that New Jersey is selected for reactivation during the Vietnam War because she was in the best material condition, even though she wasn't the most recent one to have a yard period. Well, why was she in the best material condition when she was decommissioned? It's because she had the longest period of time to do it. So why was she in the best material condition when she was being looked at in Vietnam? Well, it's because she had the longest time to reactivate. And it seems like Captain Brooks, who was the commanding officer at the time, is a real anal, detail-oriented person. So just the absolute perfect person to be in charge for this. So, in fact, he's so detail-oriented that he takes the time to write this 7-page typed letter to Captain Miner of Wisconsin. There is a complete scan of this document in PDF that we'll have in the description down below here. So if you're interested in reading it yourself, I'm not going to go through the thing line by line because it is 7 pages long, but we'll go through some of the notable points in here. Rumor has it that the Wisconsin is to join the New Jersey in mothballs, commencing inactivation in the fall. With this in mind, I feel that we might be able to offer certain experiences that you might be able to capitalize on. Is it just me? When everything goes according to plan, I don't feel the need to warn the person after me about what's about to happen. I get the distinct impression that the fact Captain Brooks feels the need to send a 7-page memo to Captain Miner coming up the pipeline behind him is that things have not been going exactly smoothly. New Jersey has had both phases Alpha, 15 January to 30 April, and Bravo, 1 May to 31 August. So New Jersey has 8 months to do this work. The other two Iowas only have half as much time. They do their decommissioning work in just 4 months, so that may well be why New Jersey is in the best material condition. Phase Alpha is the ship is assigned to the shipyard, but still an active commissioned ship, part of the Atlantic Fleet. And Bravo is the ship is still in commission, part of the inactive fleet, and then post Bravo, she is out of commission, part of the inactive fleet. So that's what's going on with that terminology there. The next sentence here. I hear Wisconsin is to have phase Bravo only. So she's going straight from being an active fleet unit, coming back from a cruise, straight into a commissioned vessel as part of the inactive fleet doing work. Being part of the inactive fleet, even if you're still in commission, means that you have less funding. It means that you've got less crew manning, so crew members are being removed from the ship. That's something that's going to be talked about in here more, I bet. So you can accomplish far less during phase Bravo than you could during phase Alpha, and far, far less than you could during both. So phase Bravo has the ship's crew at 900, which is less than half of the normal crew, but the approximate size of the crew of a peacetime cruiser. So there's almost certainly going to be something in here talking about the crew size. So the crew is less than half of what it should be, and they're trying to clean up the entire ship to a condition that is better than when the ship is being lived in. Like I said, we'll come back to crew size later. In either case, the money limitations are severe and will control how much work is done by the shipyard. We were allowed $1 million, this is in 1957 money, for Alpha, and $500,000 for Bravo. Remember, Wisconsin only has Bravo. Same for Iowa. Boiler work, reduction gears, fuel oil piping, fuel oil heating coils, and standard items virtually used up the entire $1 million in Alpha funds. So this is like a normal yard period to correct the issues they found during their last deployment, which would have been a midshipman's cruise to Europe and a stint as the flagship of Second Fleet, NATO's striking force in the Atlantic. So Wisconsin and Iowa do not get this chance to do that yard period. So boom, another reason why New Jersey is in the best material condition. Ordnance and electronics had arrival inspections, but the yard only assists the ship's force in the work accomplished. So that's another thing why it's important to have 900 people or more. If you don't have much of the ship's force, you just can't do the work yourself without the yard. By upping assist ship's force funds from 10,000 to 25,000, we managed to do numerous jobs that couldn't be covered by regular work requests, ending up with a quite satisfactory overall work list. So by having the yard workers and the ship's force work together, they were able to accomplish a lot more than just you put in a work request and wait for the yard workers to come out, or ship's force trying to do it themselves. If they could do it themselves, they would have done it underway. They wouldn't be coming into a yard to do it. The $500,000 for Bravo did not cover the two essential items of dry docking and dehumidification. Well, those are the most important things you have to do before you mothball a ship. Dehumidification is utterly critical for maintaining the ship in mothballs. You got to do it. And dry docking is essential because in addition to cleaning the underside of the hull, you have to blank over all your through hull openings. An Iowa-class battleship has something like 300 sea chests in the bottom of the ship that need to be blanked over. So it's critical that you dry dock a ship and get the dehumidification stuff installed, or else she's not ready to go into mothballs. So they spent $500,000 in 1950s money on the work that needed to be done mothballing the ship with a significantly larger crew than she's supposed to have on at this time, and still didn't have the money to dry dock or dehumidify the ship. Funds were up to $611,000 to accomplish the former and necessary of the latter, with the remainder being done by the ship's force. Recovery of some money due to overestimates by the yard disclosed after docking will permit more yard work than originally estimated. Using the additional ship's force work as a lever, we obtained permission to retain 70% of personnel during 2.5 months of Bravo rather than 1 month. So Bravo, again, is a 4-month period, so for better than half of the time, they were able to keep 70% of personnel, which is about 400 or 1,400 men on board. By the time this is being written, near the end of Phase Bravo, they're down to 900 personnel, and before the decommissioning work is done, they will drop below 500 personnel, which is roughly the number of people who are on board when the ship is actually decommissioned and placed into reserves at the end of Bravo. Here's an interesting paragraph. The command relationships are somewhat strange in the manner in which they're handled. Com, Bat, Crew, Lant, i.e. the commander of battleships and cruisers in the Atlantic Fleet, gave me exactly 0 orders on reporting to Lant Res Fleet, Atlantic Reserve Fleet. Com, Lant, Res Fleet ordered me to report to him for OPCON upon commencement of Alpha. So technically during Alpha, he's still part of Atlantic Fleet. But he's already starting to report to the Reserve Fleet instead of where he was technically under this time, and he got no orders on what to do. And that is for duty on commencement of Bravo. So this is at the beginning of Alpha. They're telling him in 4 months you're going to do X, Y, Z. He is still awaiting orders from the CNO to place the ship in commission in reserve, which should have happened at the beginning of Bravo. And then at the end of Bravo, the ship should go out of commission. All right, so the next paragraph, they're talking about, they already knew the ship was going to be decommissioned before they leave Europe during their last deployment. So on the way back to the United States, they're already going into void tanks and starting the process of chipping and painting. So that's really interesting. Gives them a head start on things. And presumably, if New Jersey knows that Wisconsin is going to be decommissioned next, Wisconsin knows this as well. So they also have a bit of a lead time on getting started. And there are a couple of things in here where he says, hey, get started on this as soon as possible. Get started on that as soon as possible. Don't wait for Bravo to start. So it would be interesting to hear from Wisconsin if they have a similar report and when they were able to start on certain things. I have insisted on berthing and messing the crew on board as long as possible, keeping the laundry, barbershop, and store open to avoid loss of man hours. The action of the Navy Department in detaching doctors and dentists immediately upon commencing inactivation has been uneconomical, and you should take steps to keep these officers until the crew is reduced below 70%. Because of the facilities at Bayonne and the New York Navy Yard where this work is happening, and because they're spread out all over the Navy base, if he reduces the ship's force and stops these critical functions now, like feeding the crew and having berthing spaces, well, then the crew has to waste time wandering across the Navy Yard to find a haircut, wandering to the ship from their barracks buildings and whatnot. And I get the impression that these 2 yards do not have all that much room at this point for the ship's company. So it's interesting that they're keeping some of these things open on board, which could otherwise have already started the inactivation process. He then laments that in addition to the doctors and dentists, the Marine detachment is also removed immediately, and that they're not providing security, so there are civilians at the yard, like cleaners and people like that, trying to come up onto the ship. They're cleaning things, and he later mentions that stuff ends up being stolen. So this might be by these civilians coming on board. It might be yardbirds taking souvenirs. The most likely cause is the ship's crew taking souvenirs as they leave. We know this happens because years later they come back to the museum and give them back to us. So interesting that he's lamenting that the Marine detachment is gone at that point. There's a section in here about they maintain a 4-section watch because they have enough of the crew, that they are doing Liberty for half of the crew on the weekends, blah, blah, blah. Then he says he will briefly to cover each of the ship's departments and things that they've learned. Operation should be one of the first inactivated. Obviously, if you're not sailing the boat around, you don't need those guys around. Most of the work falls on the electronics technicians, the ETs, so it's recommended that you start this early. And because of all the electrical equipment that has to be put away, the ETs get a lot of work, and there's a disproportionately high number of ETs in the list of decommissioning crew at the end of the ship's career because of this. The reserve fleet has finally decided on inactivation forms. It's recommended that Wisconsin get the inactivation checkoff sheets from the reserve fleet as soon as possible. It's recommended that any electronic equipment not being used on the midshipman crews be deactivated while the ship is still underway. All hardware on topside insulators must be cadmium plated or Manel. If any nuts and bolts of this type are needed, it is recommended that they be ordered now. New Jersey ordered 150 cadmium plated nuts on arrival to the yard and has received 6. At this point, we're at least 6 months into the inactivation process. Inventory books and order the missing ones now. Again, it'll take a while for them to get there. This is in the days before Amazon. There is no teletype repairman available at the New York Navy Yard. If Wisconsin has one aboard, it's recommended that you hold on to him. That seems like a lesson learned the hard way. Try to secure aerology functions before leaving Norfolk. Norfolk was the home port of all 4 battleships in the 50s. Nobody at New York knows anything about aerology. So just shutting down that whole department, do it in Norfolk because New York doesn't know anything. Gunnery is interesting. Seems like the ship's force does a lot of that work, and it seems to go along pretty easily because they do it during phase alpha. They make a strong effort to get rid of the 40mm mounts since Captain Brooks in this, feels that they would be one of the first items to come off in case these ships are recommissioned. There are already plans at this point to replace the 40mm mounts with 3-inch mounts, which is being done throughout the fleet. Just because the ships are being decommissioned, that work is never carried out. Although New Jersey has already received the directives for controlling the 3-inch mounts, as have Iowa and Wisconsin. So that's not any strong leap, and as it turns out, that is one of the first things removed in 1967 when the ship is decommissioned. We were unsuccessful, however, and had to accomplish the normal inactivation procedures for the 40mm batteries. In this connection, the yard assembled all of the 40mm igloos on the main deck prior to installation, and the main deck has been so cluttered up to that point that it's been difficult to move around. I recommend that you insist the yard do the assembly on their dock and not on my ship. So, the igloos, if you don't know, they're sometimes fiberglass, sometimes aluminum, just round structures that are built right on top of the gun tub that then encase those mounts, so they're covered from the elements. All 4 Iowas do retain their 40mm mounts and have them covered by the igloos, so that's not very forward-looking by the Navy because that's a huge amount of work servicing those weapons, and there are 20 of them on each of the Iowas. Although, except Iowa had 19 originally, and I think only has 17 by the time she's inactivated. Not particularly forward-thinking job by the Navy. That said, when New Jersey was decommissioned in '48, she was only out of commission for 2 years, and then she was immediately brought back quickly for the Korean War. So the thought at this point seems to be the ship will either be decommissioned for a very short period of time until it's needed again, or it'll never come back into service. So spending the money to remove the stuff might have been an economical reason. Just don't spend the money. It'll all go to the scrappers soon anyway, which is interesting. It's kind of outside the ordinary that the Iowas get reactivated 10 or 20 years after decommissioning, or 30 in the case of Missouri, going from 55 to 86. Between commission periods. Ooh. New Jersey's Gunnery Department had to finish all the enclosures 3 months before the end of Bravo. Bravo is only a 4-month period. So it's interesting that on Iowa and Wisconsin that only have 4 months, that they might only have a month to clean up their gunnery stuff. Wooden and inflatable lifeboats were turned into the naval yard. That makes sense. The wood's just going to deteriorate there. They can be kept in sheds at the Navy Yard. Navigation, no particular difficulty here, although we did lose 2 sets of binoculars. As you know, good stowage for pilferable articles is essential. Engineering, the bulk of our overall money went to the reduction gears and boilers. There's an interesting section in here about, since you know you're going to be decommissioned, try doing a lot of the work cleaning out your boilers ahead of time. You can take 2 entire fire rooms offline prior to decommissioning. So on their run across the Atlantic from their midshipman crews, they could have the midshipmen clean these out. Not sure if that's what actually happens in Wisconsin's case, but that's the advice Brooks is giving. Before undertaking this work, find out if you will have to hold a full power trial prior to reporting for inactivation. Of course, you're going to decommission the ship and you put them through a full set of trials beforehand, with much of the crew taken off and then causing more need to repair maintenance work. Also inactivate 2 sets of generators as early as possible, preferably engine rooms 1 and 4. Clean the uptakes before the firesides. All the soot's going to keep going down. Be sure all of the voids are inspected before making up a work list, particularly those next to fuel tanks. A number of them will have oil in them and will require cleaning. That's really interesting. An Iowa-class battleship has about 600 void spaces, about 300 of them are liquid loaded, about 300 of them are true voids. So make sure you're opening them up and sticking your heads in them to make up a work list. You got to clean the tanks that are over sea chests, because when you're doing hot work, you can't have residual fuel in them. It's interesting that they have found residual fuel in a bunch of the other tanks that were not designed to carry fuel. This could be leaking. It could be overflow. It could be that during some of these long high-speed runs, like getting the ship to Korea, they might have filled more tanks than were normally used for fuel tanks so that they could carry more fuel. And then those tanks have just been sitting there unclean for all these years. So that's interesting. Use a hammer to test all the drain lines, i.e. just hit the pipe and see if the hammer goes through it. So you can make a list of which ones need to be replaced. Make a list of all the sea chest blanks. The yard will ask for that. Carry no more fuel than is essential or required, as it must be offloaded for cleaning the tanks, and this is slow, especially in cold weather. That makes good sense. The Iowas are all deactivating during the winter. New Jersey starting in the winter of '57, and Missouri, or Iowa and Wisconsin over the winter of '57, '58. So it's very cold in the hellscape that is Bayonne. So get that work taken care of then. The fuel has the consistency of chocolate pudding at room temperature. So colder, it's even more solid. Actually, earlier on, we read about how they did work on the fuel oil radiators. So that is to preheat the fuel so it's actually liquid enough to pump. And if you're trying to deactivate your boilers ahead of time, you don't necessarily have enough steam pressure to heat all these fuel tanks in the freezing winter to get all the fuel off. Check the watch caps on the stocks for deterioration. You know, just the wool, like beanie style hats. Make sure they haven't started to fall apart, because it's going to be cold in the hellscape that is Bayonne over winter. The strain is beginning to tell in the crew. It is nasty work, and there's lots of it, so the sooner you can get started, the better off you will be. On the subject of personnel, New York appears too big a city for some of the crew, and our problems have been mounting noticeably in the past month. The only cure right now would be to get the crew to sea for a substantial time, which you can't do when you're deactivating a ship. But about the only consolation is the fact that this won't last forever. Yard periods are incredibly difficult on the crew. It's a lot of hard work, long hours, and no payoff to the work. You do hard work before a deployment, then you get to deploy and do things, go to places, use the equipment that you've worked on. Here you're doing a bunch of preventative maintenance that is on equipment that will either be removed in 10 years when the ship is reactivated or won't be used for 10 years until then. Why are you going through all this trouble? Especially when you got New York right there and all of its many vices and everything else. This is really interesting, especially looking at how much in the news lately sailor suicides during yard periods have been, particularly on USS George Washington, which is undergoing a major yard period in Norfolk right now. So this has always been a problem. We have no evidence of any suicides on this ship during this time period, but we're also don't have full logs, so it is possible that you're going to see crimes or punishments or suicides or other things like that that you often see when crew morale goes down. Make sure you make lists of everything you need. It's interesting that the ships are stored in mothballs with a full set of non-perishable spare parts on board. So there's things in here, make your allowance lists, get the parts on board. There's a section in here where they are allowed to make their own allowance list rather than go off of the Navy's prescribed list, because the things they had on their list was so different from what the Navy said. So they actually have prescribed the things that they need, and it means that when the ship is reactivated, if it's like Korea and it's after a very short time and needs to be in short order, well, heck, everything's already on board. You bring the food on board, you bring the wooden boats back on board and the crew, and you're ready to go. So that is interesting. They're talking about this. In practice, because it's so long between reactivations, that isn't really the case. And a lot of the spare parts stored on board end up getting taken off while the ship is in mothballs, as active ships need those parts. So the fact that inactive ships are used for stripping, kind of, granted not all of them, but it does mean that while that's a good idea, it doesn't actually work out in practice. Don't store flammable materials on board. That's a good one, because Wisconsin ends up with a fire on board, which bumps her down the list of being reactivated during Vietnam, because while she's in mothballs, she has a fire on board. That was probably electrical and not related to the storage of inflammables on board. So, but it's interesting that Brooks specifically mentions that. Inactivation guide. Due to the size of the battleship type, it is necessary for the ship to remain virtually self-supporting for messing and personnel services, ship store, barbershop, tailor, laundry, etc. These facilities are widely scattered and inadequate in the New York Bayonne area, and it has been deemed advisable to carry on these functions on board until total numbers on board are reduced below 500. As a consequence, some of the recommended dates in the inactivation guide for discontinuing these functions are not being met, and the Bayonne group has concurred with this. Just the battleship is so freaking big, and we have so little experience with this, that the inactivation guide just doesn't apply to it fully. So it seems like Brooks is using his best judgment here, and it seems like the man has some pretty good judgment. And he's got the time to think about things, having 8 months instead of the 4 that the Wisconsin guys have. And fortunately, since this is the first ship being deactivated, it seems like the shipyard is working with him. There's several paragraphs in here about procuring commercially baked goods when the galley closes. It is hoped that the foregoing may prove of some value. Early action on some of these items may save you later headaches. The weather will be poor during the later stages of your inactivation, and topside work will be difficult. It's a nasty, boring job at any time. With personal best wishes, C.B. Brooks, Jr. So, that is not technically the inactivation report, but a very interesting letter between Captain Brooks of New Jersey to Captain Miner of Wisconsin, warning him about what he's going to face when deactivation begins. It's interesting that there isn't enough money to do all the work they want to do on New Jersey, and there's even less of it for Wisconsin and Iowa. And this clearly shows why New Jersey was found to be in the best material condition in the 60s. And then it's obvious that she would then be in the best material condition in the 80s. But it seems like Captain Brooks is leading his crew through a very difficult time with very little guidance from above, as this is a relatively new thing for at least the folks involved at this time. And it is a difficult situation for everyone, decommissioning your ship and moving out of your home, essentially. So that's a real interesting document. If you want to read the full thing, remember it's linked in the description below. Be sure to check out that other video that we did on reactivating the ship, on the work that was done at that time. There's a whole section on getting rid of the 20mm mounts immediately. So that's interesting that here he's saying, just let us get rid of the 40s. Just let us get rid of them. We don't need these anymore. Otherwise, what do you think was the coolest thing in here? What's some other interesting stuff you noticed in here while reading it? Let us know in the comment section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate the support you guys have given the museum over the years. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to continue supporting to help the museum and our channel. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about the museum. Thanks for watching.